It's scary how easy it is to be angry at God and allow that anger to turn into a form of hatred. Welcome to Walking Through the Word for today as we are in the book of John, chapter 2. We're starting in verse 13 with Jesus in his first cleansing of the temple, and we're going to go potentially through verse 22. We'll see. But as you look at this, I don't want to make the statement that I made a moment ago, I don't want to take lightly because it is a real thing. You see, when God calls us out on a situation and how we're behavior or how we're doing things, we have really two ways of responding, especially if it's an individual that calls us out. Even though they may be doing it in the most godly and wonderful intentions, we can respond in one of two ways. Two ways we can either respond with humility and recognition that God is trying to change us to become the man and woman He wants us to be, or we can meet it with anger and resentment because we have been called out onto the carpet. And I can tell you in my own life that that's happened certainly. You know, someone calls me out, and there have been times when I've responded with proper humility and recognition. There have been other times when I've gotten flat out defensive and flat out angry because embarrassed, if you will, because I got called out. Well, we're going to see that here because when Jesus walks into the temple, he finds that people are selling oxen, sheep, and pigeons, and that there are money changers that are doing transactions there. Now, the reason why this is a significant statement is because while it is allowed you are allowed outside of the temple to sell these things, John specifically uses the wordings that translate to in the temple. In other words, these folks were beyond the acceptable boundaries, and they had turned God's house into a place of business rather than a house of worship. Now, it's important to recognize that, not dissimilar from us, they personified buildings, the palaces and the temple back then. The palace, the symbol of the king's moral and authority and representation of God and those things. And so they personified the palace. And they also did the same thing for God. So in other words, when you walked into the house of God, you were walking up to God. Okay? That was kind of the way that they viewed things. And so to see the heart of God, the temple, being perversed in this way really hurt and angered Jesus. And so he drives these people out. He drives out the sacrificial animals, the sheep and the oxen and the pigeons, showing, hey, that this stuff isn't going to be sufficient. Something else is going to have to happen. And interestingly enough, the disciples have this observation. They say, the disciples remember that it was written, zeal for your house will consume me. Now, this comes from Psalm 69, verse 9. And you can read it there. But what's interesting is if you look at the verses surrounding it, starting in verse maybe 7 and kind of going on through verse 12, you see how people responded to someone who had zeal for the Lord. Verse 7, for I endured scorn for your sake, and shame covers my face. I'm a foreigner to my own family, a stranger to my own mother's children. Because zeal for your house consumes me, and the insults of those who insult you fall on me. When I weep and fast, I must endure scorn. When I put on sackcloth, people make sport of me. Those who sit at the gate and mock me, and I am the song of the drunkards. Here's an individual, the psalmist, who is pursuing God and calling people to pursue God as well, and calling them out on the things that they are doing, and their turn and their response is they mock. They respond with anger themselves, insults. They respond they cast this person out. They do all these different things. In other words, they now have shown their disdain, their hatred of God as a result of their hatred for the person that loves and is trying to pursue God. They have inadvertently, whether they would admit it or not, shown their anger and hatred towards God because they have shown anger and hatred towards the person that was trying to help them discover God. Let's move back over to John chapter 2. Interestingly enough, right after that little reference to Psalm 69 comes out, in verse 18, suddenly the Jewish leaders of the temple show up. They had been kind of out, but suddenly Jesus does these things and he calls them to the carpet, shines a spotlight on what's going on, and their response is, hey, we're the big dogs here. What right do you have to do this? What gives you the right? What sign do you show us for doing these things? By what authority do you have to do these things? And Jesus answers immediately, and he says, you destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. Of course, the Jewish leaders didn't understand Jesus was talking about his own body. They thought that he was talking about the physical temple that they were standing in. 46 years it took, and you're going to raise this thing up in 3 days? But Jesus wasn't talking about that. In other words, he was saying, my authority is because I am the Messiah. I am the Christ. And when you kill me, I am going to come back in 3 days. This is the authority which I have to do it because I am the Son of Man. I am the Son of God. I am the Christ. I am the Messiah. This is the authority that Jesus has. But the leaders, they met Jesus with anger and disdain and hatred that flat out reflected their hatred towards God. So I go back to my original thought and idea. When someone calls you out for behavior that you know is wrong, for actions that you know are wrong, for words that you have said that you know are wrong, do you respond with humility and a recognition of what God is trying to do? Or do you respond with anger?